In this news roundup of the week for the 10th of June 2022. In the United States, the January the 6th hearings begin, but it's really all about future elections, not past ones. The European Parliament goes into full meltdown as its signature climate policies suffer major setbacks. President Putin talks about his war aims as 3 foreign soldiers are sentenced to death. And in this week's Short Thought, I talk about why it's an advantage in your life to take the initiative. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. In the US, the Democrats plan to focus attention on how terrible Trump was and what a huge insurrection took place on January the 6th moved into top gear. The House Select Committee hearings began with witness statements flagging the clear intent, which is to show that Trump was well aware that he'd lost the election and therefore that his claims to the contrary were part of a deliberate plan to undermine the result. They tried to show this by highlighting how former Attorney General William Barr had told Trump so at the time, and also that Trump's daughter Ivanka had also said that she accepted Barr's description of that reality. The alternative explanation that Trump could hear people saying such things but then simply refuse to believe them, that isn't obviously as politically helpful as suggesting that it was nefarious and deliberate. Now, there are circumstances where such a hearing would be a key part of the process of government and accountability. This isn't it. I mean, whichever side you're on, you should be able to recognise that. There's an election coming. These are politicians. The format for the sessions has been specifically designed to try to attack the attention and hold the attention of a wider audience. Now, not the die-hard Trump supporters, of course, who would never accept anything that came out about their man anyway, but the people in the middle, and particularly the swing voters, who are currently focused on the cost of living crisis, record 8.6% inflation, baby formula drought, and any one of a dozen other problems. Instead, they want them to focus on this. So, this first hearing, which millions of viewers watched, spent a lot of time teasing revelations to come in the following sessions. The committee had hired a former ABC News executive to help plan the event. As clear an indication as you can get, this is designed as a show, not as a public process. So gone were the interminable opening speeches by every single person on the committee. In this case, there were just 2. One from Chairman Benny Thompson, one from the leading anti-Trump Republican involved, Liz Cheney. Just to give the illusion of this being a bipartisan exercise, which it isn't, with the GOP boycotting it. Cheney previewed the case to be brought, but Trump was at the centre of January the 6th incursion, approved it as an attempt to overthrow the result by whatever means necessary, and she said this: President Trump summoned the mob, assembled the mob, and lit the flame of this attack. The committee then showed a video compilation from the incident, including new police body cam footage, selected to show that rather than a bunch of eccentrics wandering around the place taking selfies, which was a significant perception from the time, there was actually some extremely rough hand-to-hand combat between officers and the incursionists. But the question is this: who cares? I mean that literally. How much have people already absorbed all of this and moved on to worrying about new issues? How much will the Democrats be successful in the attempt to bring it all back front of mind in time for the casting of ballots in November? All we can say for sure is they're going to give it their best shot. That, along with just about anything else they can think of. So this week, as you would expect, people are still talking about the horrific shooting of 19 children and 2 of their teachers last week. And in the wake of a passionate speech by Oscar-winning actor and Uvalde local Matthew McConaughey, where he fluently and passionately called for bipartisanship in response, it does seem as though some agreement might be possible. I mean, I wouldn't get too carried away, but Politico was reporting that Republicans are pointedly not trying to derail current negotiations on some sort of agreed slimmed-down package of measures, indicating that a sufficient number of them might support a deal to get it through. Does it matter? Not in the slightest. I mean, sorry, but it's the gun control micromanagement equivalent of what we saw in the pandemic. For instance, when the UK changed the rules every week to the degree of laying down what counted as a substantial meal that enabled you to be in a pub. None of it made the slightest difference. It gave the illusion of action. and so it will be here. And add to that political imperative again. The Democrats do not want to be waving the bipartisan flag right now, whatever the issue. So while they may want to be seen to be seeking agreement, Joe Biden nevertheless went on to the Jimmy Kimmel Show, where he spoke, somewhat less eloquently must be said, and he called for guns to be a voting issue. And that's the point. If any legislation is going to be a case of something must be done, this is something, therefore this must be done, then at least have the empty gesture play well for the election. That's the thinking. Now, I'm not saying I blame them. The electoral situation and the cultural impossibility of anything more substantial simply leaves politicians with rather few options, but some very clear incentives. But it's as well to call it what it is. Interestingly, the Democrats seem to have an unusual ally in one of its other campaign issues, that of abortion. The European Union, specifically the European Parliament, voted on Thursday to condemn the likely overturning of Roe v. Wade, which is weird. I mean, first of all, why is it the business of the EU what judges rule in a legal case in the United States? Secondly, the Supreme Court hasn't even ruled yet. It simply had a draft opinion leaked. The motion was preceded by a vigorous debate. One left-wing MEP, Predrag Matic, said, "The draft opinion of the Supreme Court of the United States is a shock and a nightmare." Matic is from Croatia, whose abortion law is that it's legal up until 10 weeks, significantly stricter than some of the Republican states' proposed laws. The right-wing German MEP Christine Anderson replied somewhat mockingly, "The USA is no longer a colony ruled from Europe. Don't you know that?" Well, indeed. And in any case, they had problems of their own this week, mostly of their own making. The European Parliament was due to vote on key measures designed to achieve the EU target on 55% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by the end of the decade this week. Before we even got to that vote, it was clear that the war in Ukraine and the cost of living crunch was likely to put those commitments to a serious test. I mean, could you continue to promise sweeping radical action when systems are already so strained, or did you need to make a compromise? In the event, what the Parliament actually decided to do was to have a major meltdown. During the debate on the measures on Tuesday, the argument was made for a degree of realism on what should be done. So, for instance, Dolores Montserrat, a Spanish centre-right MEP, said this: "Climate change is a threat for the planet and it's a problem we have to fight. Denying it is a mistake, but it's also a mistake to not be realistic. The Commission can't ignore the economic and social consequences we're currently suffering due to COVID, the war, inflation." And the split crystallised between, on the one hand, those arguing that you shouldn't at this point burden industry and households with tough measures when it's already incredibly hard circumstances. So members of the centre-right European People's Party said they wanted decarbonisation, not deindustrialisation. But on the other side, you have the groups on the left and the Greens arguing that the imperative for ending Russian fossil fuel imports was exactly the catalyst for climate action that you should be seizing. So Aracha Garcia, the leader of the centre-left Socialists and Democrats group, said the war in Ukraine cannot be an excuse to slow down the green transition as some in this House would like. It should be the opposite. That said, the split wasn't purely on a left-right basis. Some MEPs on the left side of the spectrum also had doubts, mostly focused on the impact of stronger measures on the most vulnerable. The executive of the EU, the European Commission, had urged the Parliament to pass all the key measures. 8 were up for vote, but 3 really substantial ones to do with reforming the EU's carbon market, a carbon border tax, and a new social climate fund. All of them, said the Commission's Green Deal chief Frans Timmermans, were needed to achieve the EU targets. But the truth was clear that even before the session started, the majority for those measures was extremely narrow and under immense pressure. He denounced a compromise proposal for limiting the scope of carbon price and transport and heating to businesses, not to private households. Timmermans said the exemption would mean the policy would deliver massively smaller emissions reductions. Well, then it all fell apart. MEPs passed a series of amendments from the European People's Party to reduce some of those targets and measures. For example, the draft had sought to slash emissions via the emissions trading scheme by 67% by 2030. That was amended to 63%, with a slower reduction of carbon credits by 70 million rather than the proposed 117 million. Those votes were met with outrage from the Socialists and Greens, who demanded a 3-minute pause before the final vote, during which they decided to vote against the whole package, rather than accept the modified version. Cue shouting and screaming, finger-pointing and recriminations. The Greens and Socialists, at least those directly quoted in press reports, seemed disinclined to accept the argument that circumstances required a compromise. Jakob Dalund, a Swedish Green, was quoted as saying that a progressive majority had prevailed over the fossil alliance. MEPs had reported that they'd received intense lobbying from various industry groups, which isn't incompatible with the idea that businesses are under huge pressure. Nevertheless, environmental campaigners described the situation in typically black and white terms. So, for instance, Klaus Rohrig from the NGO Climate Action Network told EU Observer that it was a clear sign that many MEPs put industry lobby interests above all else. The failed vote on the European trading scheme had a domino effect, with MEPs deciding that if it was going to go back to committee to see if a new compromise could be found, then the other most important measures needed to do likewise, because they were all kind of dependent on each other. One thing they did eventually pass was the move to end the sales of new combustion engine vehicles by 2035, rejecting a proposal there to delay that particular phase out. Unsurprisingly, that was the part The Guardian chose to focus on for its headline. But although such issues are highly visible as tokens, it doesn't seem like it's going to get any easier to reach a compromise that is going to get agreement on the areas of more substance. No chance of any such agreement in the more substantial conflicts of our times either, the war in Ukraine. Following the trial of a Russian soldier for war crimes a few weeks ago, I pointed out what was obvious enough at the time, that Russia would seek to mirror that process with a trial of its own as soon as it was able to. And so it did this week, with 2 British-born soldiers, Aidan Aslin and Sean Pinner, along with Soudan Brahim from Morocco. They were tried as terrorists, not as combatants in a war, which meant that you didn't have to bother with all that inconvenient Geneva Convention stuff, and that resulted in them being sentenced to death by firing squad. Now, will that actually happen? Well, I mean, it might. I personally think the odds are against it, but not so much that I'd willingly change places with them, strangely. But just as Ukraine was seeking to send a message to the Russian soldiers with its original speedy trial, in that case that they would be held accountable if they committed war crimes, so Russia is sending a message now, particularly to foreign fighters, of whom significant numbers have come in to support Ukraine. To send that message, it is enough that the sentence is handed down. If that subsequently turned into a prisoner swap, for instance, say in exchange for Putin's ally Viktor Medvedchuk, well, it already did its work. Still, with all respect to the individuals concerned, notwithstanding the fact that it took the attention of British newspapers, this is, of course, a sideshow. Because this week we started to see the real strains growing on the Ukrainian Defence Forces, with the acknowledgement by President Zelensky that something like 200 Ukrainian fighters per day are being killed in the Donbass region. These are much higher numbers than before, and the previously high morale of the Ukrainian fighters has suffered, as you would expect. Indeed, according to a leaked intelligence report, that has seen a gradual rise in the number of people deserting, although it's not yet seen as a major problem. Kiev's troops are outnumbered 20-1 in artillery and 40-1 in ammunition by the Russians. The fiercest fighting is taking place over the city of Severodonetsk. Ukraine said that its forces had successfully pushed back a Russian attack on the Toshkivka village on the outskirts of the city, but elsewhere there is a bloody stalemate. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin was comparing himself to Peter the Great and talking about how his war goals were really about, quote, Reclaiming Territory for Russia. At a meeting with young entrepreneurs and scientists, well, those that didn't flee the country in the early days of a war anyway, he explained his view of geopolitics. Peter the Great waged the Northern War for 21 years. You might think he was fighting with Sweden, seizing their lands. He wasn't capturing them, he was reclaiming them. It's a game that most people can play, of course. It just depends which specific moment in history you choose to focus on and celebrate as the natural order of things. In any case, he went on to suggest that he expected swathes of Ukraine would soon be reclaimed by Russia and eventually everyone would simply recognise it as Russian. This was an interesting frank admission because it rather cuts across the narrative that many of the war critics in the West have been amplifying, that it's all about the aggressive expansion of NATO and Russia seeking to defend itself. Indeed, he explicitly repeated this view, as I described it in my recent video, on how he sees the world. A country is either sovereign or a colony, he said. There is no state in between. Countries like Ukraine and basically most of those bordering Russia fit into the colony status, but because of Russia's strength, it was sovereign. And therefore that means you cannot constrain its territorial ambitions. At least that seemed to be what he was hinting when he said this. It's impossible, do you understand? Impossible to build a fence around a country like Russia. And we do not intend to build that fence. One thing Peter the Great did not have, of course, was a brigade of military computer hackers. But we heard a bit this week about why that group has made less of an impact so far in the Ukraine war than we might have expected. Specifically, it comes down to the fact that Ukraine has already been the focus of such attacks so much over the last 8 years, culminating in the NotPetya attack I discussed in this week's video. They have developed a great deal of resiliency in keeping offline backups of every single thing, having manual systems for clearing out infections and restoring them. The fact that many of their systems, such as electric power grids and the like, are less automated than those in the West has been an advantage in building that resiliency. And it has been needed because those attacks have been taking place, it's just that they quickly recover from them. Which is no comfort at all for some of the obvious targets in the West, from the highest levels of infrastructure all the way down to, well, the Wimbledon tennis tournament, due to get underway in a few weeks, having banned Russian tennis players from taking part. They are reportedly highly nervous, justifiably so, that there will be attempts to hack their systems during the tournament. It would be rather astonishing if there weren't, based on recent history. Having banned the athletes in order to avoid any symbolic victories for the Russian government, that could easily be undone by, say, Sandworm taking over control of the electronic scoreboard to celebrate the new achievements of Putin the Great. Something to look forward to. Here's something that I learned from my time dealing with businesses. Successful people make the world respond to them. And if they get a response they don't like, they take responsibility for it. They adjust what they do until they get the responses they do like. On the other hand, unsuccessful people, they get a bad response, they take it personally, either holding that they've been exposed as being inferior and beneath respect, or otherwise blaming all the people around them for being mean to them. There are certain ways that I got to see this in action. So one of the privileges I got from that time was to do some training from some of the top professional firms on how to work the room. And you added that to the fact that then as now I read widely on a range of related topics, and I was fully aware that if you were entering, for example, a big social event or a professional conference or any such thing, how people responded to you was highly dependent on how you behaved in the first few seconds up to a minute of entering the room. And even though it's not my natural preference, I taught myself to be able to march in like I was completely at home. I had some pre-prepared, interesting conversation openers. I just walk straight up to one of the nearest groups and start to engage them. And there are times when I did that with groups of people where I knew nobody, and I managed to make a huge impression. People were coming up to talk to me when they found out I was visiting from the UK, offering to show me around the city. All sorts of things. The dynamics were just flowing. It helps usually that I could say I was one of the speakers. That gave me a certain something, but it wouldn't have been a huge problem if it hadn't been the case. A few times later on, I decided, you know what? That's a lot of work for a natural introvert like me, and I had no stake whatsoever with the people in this particular group, and I just decided not to do it. I was just going to enter the room quietly, have a look around, talk to anyone who talked to me first for sure, and just pay attention how much difference that did or didn't make. And I'm sure you can guess it made a huge difference. When you enter the room, people are vaguely aware of you even if they're not focusing on you. If you're on your own for more than half a minute, you convey the impression of social awkwardness. People will intuitively, without malice I'm sure, avoid you from that point. Now, I didn't care in that situation, but it was really interesting. Firstly, I didn't care because it wasn't personal. Nobody in those first examples knew me. Nobody in the second examples knew me. The difference in how people responded was purely being driven by my own behaviour. But you could see how if you were someone who only ever experienced the latter and knew little of group dynamics, they would conclude that there's something wrong with them and maybe people are judging them for who they were. Of course, plenty of people have advantages in such things. They might be taller, they might have Hollywood good looks, impressive deep voices, whatever. The various signals we tend to attach meaning to. Now, I'm not being overly modest to say I had few of those things working for me. You can still always make the most of what you have, whatever it is. Now, beware. This is an encouragement to engage in self-interested and boorish behaviour. You should be paying attention to the kind of impact you're having. But you tend to do better if you make people respond to you rather than purely responding to others. And if you choose not to do that, well, fine. Watch for dynamics with interest, with the detachment of the scientific observer. It's not something to be taken personally. All right, a reminder that from next week I will be moving to a standard target of just 2 videos per week. This one will stay in this slot on the Friday. The other one might move around a bit so that I can focus on the quality of the video, not necessarily the imminence of the deadline. Thanks to all of you who joined me for the final live stream on Wednesday. Towards the end, the software I was using bumped the stream. I was able to get it reconnected after a minute or so, so if you left at that point, there is still a little bit more that you could go back and watch. I couldn't do the final thing without one last technical glitch. Just one thing I won't be missing in the post-live stream world. In the meantime, there is just time for me to thank, as always, the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Without them, I simply could not take the time that I do in producing these videos. If you would like to join that important community of free thinkers and add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.